anyway, so I'm trying to look at the presidents through different prisms. And what I found was the White House photographers were a perfect example of this, because these are the staff photographers, not the news photographers, who I'll talk about a little bit. But basically, these are the photographers hired by the presidents to take pictures and to comprise sort of a visual history of the presidency. And they're sort of lost to historians or the public or even journalists like me. But I tried to put this together. I talked to all the chief photographers who are still with us, literally, and I found that through their lenses and through their personal observations, we get pictures of the presidency that we don't really have in other places. One thing that I'd like to mention, I always get asked about this, is how do you get these photographs, which I'm about to show you? These photographs belong to us as taxpayers. If you go to the National Archives or the presidential libraries, you can go online, you can go to them in person, you can look through the photographs, and there's a minimal reproduction cost, but you could get them yourself. And so it's not that now that the presidents are out of office, it's gone into the public domain. So that's one point. But the other is how much technology has affected White House photography over the years. I'd like to show this picture. It's not a great picture, but this is a picture of James Polk, who was president in the 1840s. This is one of the first photographs ever taken of a president in office, just to show how things have changed over the years. In those days, it was called a daguerreotype, primitive form of photography. And they actually had to get a picture like this. They'd open the frame, and the person would have to sit still for a long period of time for the image to be collected onto the photograph. So there was actually a brace that even the president had to have on his neck to hold him in place. So just keep this in mind as we go through to see how things have changed, how photography has changed over the years. But the first president to really use photography as a campaign tool and as a tool of the presidency was Abraham Lincoln. He was running for president in 1860. Lincoln was thought of as a frontiersman. He was a guy who some people liked that image, but he felt that he needed to show more stature. He needed to show that he was capable of being president and wasn't just sort of a yokel from the rail splitter, as they called him, a guy who built fences out in the primitive areas of Illinois at the time. So he was giving a speech to Cooper Union, which was a place for the intelligentsia in New York to discuss things and so on, sort of an academy. And he knew this would be important for his campaign to appeal to the intelligentsia, and he decided this would be the speech where he'd outline his views on slavery, preserving the Union, secession, and so on. The afternoon of that speech, he went to the photography studio of a man named Matthew Brady. You might be familiar with Matthew Brady. He became a very famous Civil War photographer, took a lot of the pictures that we know, that we're familiar with, of battles, after the battles, and so on. He went to Brady's studio, and he said, I'm Abraham Lincoln, I'm running for president. I'd like to have a picture taken so I can distribute around the country so people can see what I look like. Usually in those days, they had what they called cartes de visite, which are like postcard-sized photographs that they would distribute of people who were famous, and it was basically a headshot. Brady took one look at Lincoln and decided a headshot's not going to work. First of all, this was not a good-looking man, and Lincoln shows up. He has wrinkles on his face. He has dark circles under his eyes. His clothes are ill-fitting. He's dusty. So what Brady does is very smart. He pulls the camera back, and this is the image that he got. You can't see the imperfections in Lincoln. You can see his full stature. He was much taller than most of the men of his age. And you can see whether his left hand is on a pile of books. And people would study these pictures carefully, so this was not lost on them. So he's got this image of erudition here. And this picture was distributed around the country, and it worked. Lincoln later said that there's two things that got him elected president in 1860. The speech at Cooper Union, which was distributed as his campaign platform, basically, and this photograph, which changed his image from the frontiersman to somebody who was capable of being president. While he was president, he had about 70 photographs taken of himself. And this is the image that we all remember of Lincoln, the resolute, strong president. This is the image he liked to portray to the country. But he also allowed the photographers, and these were not staff photographers, these were commercial photographers who came by and took his picture, often with Matthew Brady's studio. He allowed them to take pictures to show him in various parts of his presidency, including his decline. And people talk about how presidents decline in office, how it's so grueling and difficult for them to deal with. Well, you rarely have the kind of illustration of that as you have with Lincoln. Look at this, him. This is him in about the beginning or middle of his first term. And this is him at the end of his presidency. Now look at the dramatic change. He's the gaunt, frail-looking guy. So he wanted this to go out to the country so people would see the toll that the presidency and the Civil War was taking on the country's leader. So he's using this to reflect sort of he's the spiritual father of the country being saved from the Civil War and from slavery and so on. So it's an interesting dynamic that he created. And since then, the most effective presidents have understood that photography can be a very important tool in governing the country and in running for office. Theodore Roosevelt, we're fast forwarding here. I can't talk about all the presidents, but basically we just don't have enough time. Theodore Roosevelt thought of himself as a man who is encapsulated by the phrase strenuous life. He felt you had to achieve whatever you could achieve at the height of your ability, publicly and privately. So he used photography to illustrate this. He did all kinds of things to show how vigorous he was, and he did them genuinely. He enjoyed boxing. Presidents don't box anymore, but he was boxing. He was canoes, horseback. He would go out and he'd ride horseback, and he'd go through jumps on the horses, and he'd come back, and his wife would know immediately he'd been out jumping because he'd fall off the horse and he'd come back all scratched up and have abrasions on himself. And so she'd say, well, you were riding against it. He said, yeah. But he did get pictures like this, which are distributed to the country. So the vigorous, active president. So it tied in with his image. He went down to the Panama Canal. This is him in a giant steam shovel. He was the first president to travel outside the country as president. It wasn't done then, but he did it. A pioneer in many ways. This is what he thought was one of his achievements, building the Panama Canal. And this was, again, conveying this through photography. And then he used photography to move from his own image to calling attention to his policies. This is him with John Muir, the famous naturalist in Yosemite in California. You can see the famous waterfall behind him. So what he's doing here, he's moving from just conveying impressions of himself to conveying impressions of what his policies are like. And so it's become sort of a dual mission there on his part. Franklin Roosevelt, his distant cousin, becomes president, and President Roosevelt had another important use of photography. He wanted the country to believe in his optimism, that he'd always feel that we will get through the Depression, we would win World War II. And so this is the image he liked to convey in photographs of himself, the jaunty, positive Franklin Roosevelt. He liked pictures taken of him with other world leaders. You can see the confidence, the sort of brimming with confidence in his picture with Stalin and Churchill. But he, as Lincoln, allowed pictures to be taken showing his decline. And by the end of his presidency, he was elected 4 times. And he died in 1945, the beginning of his 4th term. But look at him now. Look at how he's declined. This is him with Stalin and Churchill again. This is when he had terrible heart problems. He was getting frail and weak, but he allowed these pictures to be taken so people could see that the presidency was taking a toll on him, that he was sharing the sacrifice in the rest of the country. There was a private side of Roosevelt as well. President Roosevelt, when he was about 39 years old, contracted polio. His legs were paralyzed. He never recovered the use of his legs. This was not disclosed to the country, the extent of his disability. I think most people realized he had polio, but they didn't realize that his legs were paralyzed. He couldn't walk, so he had to use a wheelchair. This is taken in Hyde Park, his home in upstate New York. This is where he let his guard down, and this is a rare picture, but he let his family and friends take pictures of him like this. This was the private Roosevelt, but he managed to persuade, through his press secretary, the news photographers, this is before the staff photographers came on scene, he persuaded the news photographers not to show him in this vulnerable state with his legs paralyzed. When he would approach a podium like this, he was coming off stage, he'd have one of his sons and a Secret Service agent hold him by the elbows, hold him up, and it looked like he was walking, but he actually had braces on his legs from his ankles to his hips, locked in place. So he'd make a very slow movement to the podium, looking like he was basking in the cheers of the crowd, but it was very exhausting for him because he was actually being lifted to the podium by these two men on either side of him. But the photographers, it was sort of a conspiracy of silence. They didn't show Roosevelt in these cases. He had to be carried to his limousine many times, physically carried there. And his press secretary said to the photographers, if you don't show President Roosevelt in these vulnerable situations, we will give you more access to the president than ever happened before. The photographers went along with it. Later, some of them regretted doing this because they felt they should have given the country the information about him, but they didn't. And so it's a case, we can't imagine that happening today. So he's using photography to show him as a strong, positive leader, and the private side is not known to most of the country. I'll let you decide whether that was wise or not. Certainly for him as a public relations device, it worked, but for the journalists, there was a lot of regrets that they went along with this. And this, again, is his image that he liked to convey publicly, the V for victory, and that's what people remember Franklin Roosevelt for. Harry Truman got along very well with the news photographers. This is him at his home in Key West. If ever you can get there, you can go to Roosevelt's home in Hyde Park and his retreat in central Georgia. But Harry Truman would go to Key West, where he sort of took over the Admiral Commandant's house and went down there in the winters. And he got along very well with his photographers. They called him Truman the Human because he was very accessible and so on. And so they were really, again, it was the days when people covering the White House, photographers and news people, were quite close to the president and probably too close for our taste today. But there was a case where the photographers felt that he wasn't looking too good in photographs because his glasses were too thick. So they actually gave him glasses with fake lenses in them so they wouldn't distort his eyes. And he tried to wear them and he couldn't see anything. So he said, well, look, I can't wear these. I can't see what I'm reading in my speeches. And plus, it's not me. So he said, never mind. I appreciate what you're doing, but I'm going to be me. And they respected that. But it was another effort to protect the president, actually. And this is a famous picture of Truman taken by the news photographers, the famous picture of the false headline took about fake news, where the Chicago Tribune printed some issues up expecting that Dewey would win, and of course he did not, so Truman got a hold of the early edition. And of course the reverse happened. You can see how happy Harry is here. And but this was the days when the photographers could be on the side of the presidents, and you saw that in the coverage of Harry Truman. Eisenhower comes into office. This is him and his wife, Mamie. He's coming in as the guy who is trying to bring normalcy back to the country. He's not trying to be glitzy or fancy. He's not trying to use public relations. He was well known as the hero of World War II, who led us through the Normandy invasion. So he's trying to bring normalcy back, and he succeeds. That's what people wanted from the president in those days. The photographs that Eisenhower liked to release were pretty domestic, very, very sort of reassuring to people. When he'd go up to his home in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, his wife, Mamie, would want this to be a place where only family things or personal leisure time activities would be conducted, so she'd play Scrabble with him. Now, take a look at Ike's face here. He doesn't look like he's wild about playing Scrabble here, does he? It looks like his mind is elsewhere, and I think it was. I'd like to see what he's got on the board there. But anyway, he went along with it. But this is what the country wanted at the time, so he didn't really have to use public relations through photography. But his successor, the Kennedys, did. This is a picture, an early picture of Joe Kennedy, Rose Kennedy, and their family at Hyannisport. You can see President Kennedy, who later became president, on the sort of kneeling there on your left, and Joe Kennedy Jr. is on the right. This is a later picture of them, but what you see is happening here is Joe Kennedy, the father, was not only a fabulously wealthy investor, he was a Hollywood producer. He made movies. He understood celebrity. And so he was trying to groom his oldest son, Joe Jr., who you see here on the far right, to be president. And so he was trying to create this image of this charismatic, exciting young guy. Joe Jr. was killed in World War II as a flyer over Europe. So Jack Kennedy went to the top of the ladder in the family, and he's in the middle of the picture in the back. So Joe Kennedy tries to create this impression of Jack Kennedy as this leader of the future. He understands the importance of celebrity, that you have to have some charisma. So he's using photography here to create this image of Kennedy as this rising leader of the future. They found pictures of him as the commander of a PT boat during World War II in the Pacific, PT 109. A movie was made about this too. And so he was being portrayed as a hero through photography. He marries Jacqueline Bouvier. They were married in Rhode Island. This is a picture of him after they've been married. They're sitting at the table as the guests are arriving there for their meal. Again, it's the excitement, the glamour that he's trying to create, even before Kennedy is known nationally, but he's trying to create, the father is trying to create this impression of Kennedy as this charismatic leader through photography. You remember the old, you may not remember the old Look magazine and Life magazine, very popular photo-oriented magazines. The father was able to get this kind of picture in these magazines repeatedly, and it really helped Kennedy's image as a coming star of politics. This is election night when he wins. They were standing there, we're getting ready for a formal portrait. I show you this one because I think it's a more interesting picture. Because look at how President Kennedy is the center of everybody's attention. His father's looking at him, the admiration, the jubilation. It's a wonderful picture illustrating how that family dealt with his victory. This is after it was clear he won. So this was actually the morning after the election because it was so close they didn't realize he won until the next morning. But you can see Rose there and Jackie in the red dresses. The family is just delighted. And so this use of photography is continuing after he's elected. This is a wonderful picture. I mean, I could show you these pictures for hours because, Kennedy once said to a photographer, if ever I get into pictures with my children, I can't miss. And he was right. This is a picture, they were trying to get a formal picture of the president and his wife and Caroline. And of course, Caroline, as children will do, is not doing what their parents want. She's nibbling on her mother's pearls. So this is the picture they distributed. And it's another wonderful picture of the family man. He had problems in his marriage, but he was devoted to his children, and this is cemented that notion. Again, he's president. He has the children into the Oval Office, and he really did do this. This was not phony. He'd sit there. He had back problems, so he had to sit, and he'd have them come in and they'd dance for him. He's clapping his hands here. So these are pictures that were distributed around the country. You can see what's happening. He's now the family man. He's trying to bond with people. This is, again, another picture of him at Hannesport with Caroline. This is the most famous picture of Kennedy with his children. This is John Jr. What happened was Kennedy loved to have pictures taken with the kids, but Jackie, his wife, decided too many pictures were taken, maybe going to the heads of the children, so she wanted them to cool it. So she said, no more pictures of the children for a while. President Kennedy didn't like this, but he said, okay. Jackie goes on vacation to Greece with her sister and her sister-in-law, and President Kennedy calls one of his favorite outside photographers named Jacques Lowe and says, this was Stanley Tredick, and says, Jackie is gone, the coast is clear, come on over. So he rushes over just in time for John Jr. to brush past him in his pajamas and robe and go into the office, the Oval Office, where Kennedy was working on some paperwork. Now, of course, he's pretending to be working here, but what John Jr. would do is he'd hide under the desk, and there was a little trap door there, and he'd open the door and he'd surprise guests, and he'd scare them. And he called it his secret cave. The photographer arrived. John Jr. ran past him, got into the desk, and so the photographer got this fabulous picture. Kennedy, at this point, has hired the first chief White House photographer, a guy named Cecil Stoughton, who was an Army photographer, and he gave him the access to take a lot of great pictures. In this case, he gave the access, the better shot was gotten by the outside photographer, Stanley Tredick, but in deference to Cecil, President Kennedy said, well, Cecil, this is a great picture. Why don't you get a picture of this too? And Cecil got it from another angle. It didn't turn out as well as this one. So Cecil really missed the boat on this one. But Kennedy was starting to give Cecil a lot of access. This just gives you a little indication of how he was in public. The press conferences, the smiling, gracious, witty president. We don't see that today, but basically this is the image he liked to convey. He liked pictures taken of him privately with world leaders. Roosevelt and others had pictures, public pictures taken, but Kennedy let the photographer Cecil Stoughton in to take pictures of him with other world leaders privately, just for a few minutes, to give the impression of him sort of in charge of our foreign policy. This was a famous meeting he had with Nikita Khrushchev, who was the leader of the Soviet Union. It did not go well. You can get a little sense of this here because Khrushchev felt that Kennedy was sort of a callow, immature guy who he could take advantage of. Of course, he misread him because after the Bay of Pigs incident, which was a disaster for the United States in 1961, the next year, Kennedy succeeded in the Cuban Missile Crisis, where Khrushchev misinterpreted him. But this gives you a little sense of what Kennedy was trying to do here to show he was a world leader capable of commanding the world stage. He liked pictures taken of him with the military brass. Doesn't get along with the military brass after the first year. He feels that they misled him with the Bay of Pigs Cuban invasion. So you can see there's sort of almost a tension in the air here. And he's now relying more on his own judgment and the judgment of his brother Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General, rather than the military brass, which was wise at that time. And then one other thing Kennedy did that I wanted to mention, he learned from photography in addition to using photography to promote himself. He came into office thinking he would be a foreign policy president. The only African American he knew really was the valet who would lay out his clothes and draw baths for him. But as time went on, he started to recognize the civil rights movement as a moral issue. He respected physical bravery, so he saw scenes like this of protesters being attacked by police dogs, high-pressure hoses being trained on them being beaten, and he respected that. He felt this was physical courage, so by the end of his presidency, he had favored the civil rights movement as a moral issue. So what I'm getting at here is he's learning from photography in addition to using it. And then by the end of his presidency, he had more African Americans in the White House on one occasion when Martin Luther King gave his famous speech than all of our presidents had in total in the history of the United States. So you can see what's happening. He's moving closer. And he allowed this to be shown in photography. This is an iconic picture. Kennedy thought of it, and the photographer thought of it as the loneliest job. It looks like the burdens of the office are on his shoulders. He looks like he's sagging here. There's a New York Times photographer named George Thames who wanted to do a day in the life of the president. So he was given tremendous access to Kennedy during a particular day, in and out of the Oval Office all day, unheard of today. At one point, he saw Kennedy doing this, and he rushed in and he took his picture. It's not at all what it seems. All Kennedy's doing is he's reading the newspaper, standing up. There's no loneliest job. That's not what's happening here. But it took on a life of its own, and Kennedy loved the picture. So Thames showed Kennedy layouts of the Sunday Times photograph spread for the next weekend, and Kennedy looked through it. This picture was on the third page of the layout, and he pointed it and he said, "This should have been on the cover." So he knew the photography better than the photographer did, because this was the best picture they got. And this, again, has taken on a life of its own. But Kennedy liked that, because what he's doing is he's using photography to create an image for himself that fit in with his whole presidency. Finally, his funeral. He's killed in Dallas in 1963. This is the funeral. Little John Jr. is standing there with the grieving widow. Jackie, Teddy Kennedy, is over her one shoulder, and Bobby Kennedy is next to her on the other side. What's happening here, this is one of the most memorable pictures, very poignant image. Jackie Kennedy, brilliantly aware of public relations, is trying to create this Camelot image for her husband, this special time in the history of the country and the world with this young, dynamic president. And now that this is the end of his presidency, it's the funeral. She says to little John Jr., "It's time for you to say goodbye to Daddy." And so she says, "Why don't you salute him?" So he steps forward and he salutes him. Two wire service photographers got this picture. Everybody else was trained on Jackie and the brothers. It only lasted for like a few seconds. So only a few photographers got the picture, but this was this sort of an iconic picture from the Kennedy era. So even Jackie now understands the importance of image and is fully participating in this with the legacy of her husband. Now, Lyndon Johnson takes over. This is him on Air Force One at the day Kennedy is killed. He's in this suffocatingly hot compartment. Jackie is standing next to him and wearing the same outfit that she has worn that morning when her husband was killed. He's brought in a local judge, who he knows, because Lyndon Johnson was from Texas. He was on the trip, vice president at the time. He's being sworn in. He wanted this picture taken because he understood the importance of the image of the moment to show that the Constitution endured and we continue the Kennedy legacy. So he had Cecil Stoughton, remember he was Kennedy's photographer, who was still on the job, of course, that day, come in, rush in, stand on a little couch to take a picture a little bit from above. Jackie Kennedy, you know, every time I look at this, you realize the grief in her face, and the Kennedy entourage never forgave Johnson for this because they felt like he should not have put her through this. But she understood. She never resented this. She felt that she understood what he was trying to do, and so she went along with it. And it did work. It did show a certain continuity, and that was Lyndon Johnson's first experience with the presidency and photography. But as time went on, he sort of fell down on the job. He did things that thought make him look great in sort of a Texas Western way that the country didn't really understand and didn't really get. He liked to lift up his pet beagles by the ears. So you can see he did it more than once. And he thought, he said, the beagles don't care. Well, he would get endless numbers of letters. So after he did this a couple of times, he stopped doing it. But this is an example of Lyndon Johnson and his own definition of public relations, which really didn't work very well. When he first came into office, he would sit there and he'd look at the photographs Cecil Stoughton was getting of him every day, at the end of every day, and if he didn't like them, he'd pick them up from a stack and he'd throw them on the floor in the Oval Office. Often he was left with no pictures. So he would say to Cecil Stoughton, who had been Kennedy's photographer, "Why don't you make me look as good as Jack Kennedy?" Well, that was not going to happen. You know? So he tried to develop his own public relations strategies, like showing his gallbladder scar. Now, I don't think any other president would have done anything like this, but he thought that there were rumors that he had cancer, and that's why he was out of commission for a while. So he said, "Well, why don't I show the country my scar, and then they'll know I don't have cancer?" So this picture is the picture that emerged. I mean, you know, it's kind of crude. It's very crude, but this is the way Lyndon Johnson was. So in a sense, we're seeing the unvarnished Lyndon Johnson, and he's the Texas. This is the kind of image he liked: the horseman, the cowboy, and but it really doesn't work for him very well. Largely because of the Vietnam War. But he did give access to his photographers. He fired Cecil Stoughton, and he brought in a Japanese-American photographer named Yuichi Okamoto, who was one of the best photographers ever to work at the White House, maybe the best staff photographer, because what he's doing is he's taking pictures as a storyteller, not just capturing a moment. And other photographers have pointed to Okamoto as the best. This is a case where Lyndon Johnson is portraying the Vietnam War as going well. This is the 50th anniversary of the Tet Offensive. You might have heard some coverage about this, which was a terrible series of battles in Vietnam. But basically, Lyndon Johnson is telling the country the war is going well. His son-in-law, Chuck Robb, who later became governor and then senator from Virginia, but at the time he was a Marine combat officer in Vietnam, sent his father-in-law a tape. You can see the old reel-to-reel tape at the bottom of the picture. So he described what's really going on over there, and it's not at all what Johnson said. So you can see the angst. Johnson's head is down as he listens to his son-in-law play this tape, and he feels that he's in the unwinnable war that he can't extricate the country out of. And so this picture, it was not released at the time, but it's part of the visual archive you can find in the Johnson Library. Mr. Nixon, this is the image he liked to convey. There's a certain resonance to today, isn't there? This is the tough guy, never wants to show weakness. This is the image Nixon liked to show. He, as with other presidents, did not, other presidents, but not all of them, did not like his photographer to take too many private personal pictures. So you don't have a lot of those appealing private pictures, for instance, that Kennedy had or that Obama later would have. So Nixon did not really trust the photographers very well, and that's a very important thing for the photographers to do their jobs. They not only need to be good photographers, but they need to have the trust of the president. Nixon never gave that to his photographer, a guy named Ollie Atkins. He would have a philosophy of 6 and out. He listened for the camera to click 6 times, and then he'd say to the photographer, "You're out of here," and that was it. He wouldn't allow other pictures to be taken. This is the most requested picture of any president at the National Archives. A call comes into the White House one day. The caller says, "This is Elvis Presley. I would like to come and see the president." So they say, "Oh, sure, this is really Elvis Presley." Well, it turned out to be Elvis. He says, "I'm an admirer of law enforcement, and I would like to get a badge so I can help catch drug dealers." The irony is that Elvis was abusing prescription medications himself at the time. So he gets into the White House. Before he went in, Nixon says, "Well, what is this Elvis? I don't know anything about Elvis. I don't know what I'm going to talk to him about." But they let him in because Nixon thinks this could help him with young people. So the best he could come up with in the chit-chat is, "That's quite an outfit you have on there, Mr. Presley." And Elvis says, "You have your audience and I have mine." So it was a pretty good comeback. But this picture didn't really work for either of them. Elvis got his badge and Nixon got the picture, but it didn't help either of them. But Nixon was trying, at least, to reach out. This is one of the final pictures taken of Nixon where he finally relented. He let the private photos be taken. He announced he was going to withdraw, resign in August 1974. That he was going to resign the next day and he would take office the next day. But this is the night, his last night in the White House. He asked his photographer to come over out of the blue and take his picture with his family. And they're crying. Tricia, his one daughter, is standing in tears. Julie, his other daughter, is hugging her father. It actually is quite a poignant moment. And no one is quite clear why he agreed to have this taken, because he never did this before. But finally, he relents and he lets the personal photograph be taken. This is his last meal at the White House. There's something poignant about this because after all the pomp and ceremony and all the excitement that Nixon hoped to create, this is what it comes down to. His final meal, a pineapple ring, cottage cheese, and a glass of milk served on White House china and silver. Well, there's something poignant about this, so I always like to show this to show sort of how glory passes. Gerald Ford has one of the best relationships the president's ever had with a photographer, with David Kennerly. He succeeds Nixon. He's not elected on his own, but he did have a very good relationship with Kennerly. He was very open in a lot of things. He went skiing in Vail. He'd take a tumble. The news photographers would get the picture, as would Kennerly, but he didn't really object. He felt that, okay, maybe they're trying to embarrass him, but he was the one who took the fall, and he was the only one who was responsible for it. Very magnanimous about this. He liked to have pictures taken in the way he was. Having a meeting with senior officials in his pajamas. We don't see that anymore, but Gerald Ford allowed himself to be shown as he really was. And he just was unable to show the best parts of himself to the country. And this is Betty Ford, his wife. She had been a dancer, and as he loses his bid for election, and she says to Kennerly, his photographer, "You know, I always wanted to dance on the table in the cabinet room. Let's go do it." So that's what she did. Took her shoes off and danced on the table. Wonderful picture. It showed the down-to-earth quality of the Fords, but as I say, it really didn't help because he had all kinds of other problems. He was unable to convey this to the country. Jimmy Carter never hired a chief photographer. Think about any pictures you can picture of him, sort of an ingratiating private photograph of Jimmy Carter. You can't, because he didn't let the photographers do it. This is one of the most famous pictures of him with Menachem Begin and Anwar Sadat, where he gets the Camp David Accords, peace between Israel and Egypt, a great achievement for Carter. But other than this, there's not a lot of great pictures of Carter, and it really hurt him. I think he could have had a lot more ingratiating photography. As a result, this is the kind of thing you got. Photographers turned against Carter. They felt he was not helping them, and so he went for a jog in a race outside of Camp David, and he started to collapse from dehydration. And so he had to be carried to the finish line. And this is a famous picture from the time. But this is what happens when the president doesn't proactively try to construct a more positive image on photography. The photographers can find a way to get back at them. But of course, Carter helped because he's the one who did collapse, and he never forgot this. President Reagan takes office. This is one of his most favorite pictures of him, the Westerner, the affable outsider from Washington. He loved this picture, he hires a chief photographer himself, and he gives the guy tremendous access. This is one of the most famous photographs. This is when Reagan is shot outside the Washington Hilton Hotel. This is the moment that the bullet strikes Reagan in the chest. You see the Secret Service guys are looking off to see John Hinckley Jr. firing rounds at Reagan. One of the rounds bounces off the limousine, and a fragment of it hits Reagan in the chest. At this moment, this was taken by a news photographer, Ron Edmonds, who won a Pulitzer Prize for this. The White House photographer was, Mike Evans, was out of position, didn't get the best picture. They push Reagan into the car. The Secret Service guys decide he's in bad shape. They take him right to the hospital rather than the White House. If they hadn't done that, he would have died. He was in terrible, terrible condition. He gets to the hospital, and he survives. But this is sort of one of the iconic pictures. Reagan tries to come up with a deal with Mikhail Gorbachev, the leader of the Soviet Union at the time, at Reykjavik in Iceland. They would try to do, Reagan is trying to do away with nuclear weapons, actually. It's a huge, profound proposal. It doesn't work because Gorbachev would not accept what they called Star Wars at the time, the Strategic Defense Initiative designed to shoot down missiles coming to the United States. So the deal collapses because Gorbachev will not go for this Strategic Defense Initiative. This is them walking to their cars. You can see the disappointment in their faces. It captures the moment beautifully. Pete Souza is the photographer. He then later becomes Obama's photographer, but he's now working for Reagan. And he hears the last words that they say as Reagan gets into the limousine. Gorbachev says to Reagan through a translator, "I don't know what else I could have done." And Reagan says to him, "You could have said yes." And that was like the headline the next day. So the photographer is here on the scene, hears that, passes it along, and it's released by the White House. So, and this is the famous tear down this wall moment, and Reagan was very good at understanding the importance of imagery. I happened to be at this event at the base of that podium with a small group of us in the press corps, and I must say, when he said tear down this wall, we thought that the old guy had lost it, because we thought they're never going to tear this wall down while we're alive. But he was right and we were wrong. But it was captured in this kind of a moment which Reagan understood. I show you this because lots of times things are happening in the White House that we don't know about in the press corps, even though we think we know so much. Reagan did reach out to a lot of people in the community that people never knew at the time. He had a tremendous correspondence with people. He'd write letters to people. And he went to a school in Washington, and he asked the principal, "Could you give me somebody I can be a pen pal with?" So he came up with a guy named Rudy Hines, a precocious young African-American student who's here in the picture. Reagan kept the correspondence up with Rudy Hines for the rest of his life. Rudy Hines, as a man, attended Reagan's funeral many years later. But Reagan would go to the home of Rudy Hines and his single mom and have dinner there, which is what this picture is. He allows his photographer, Mike Evans, to take the picture. This is part of the visual history that I was talking about, the storytelling part. They didn't release this picture because they thought it would invade the privacy of the family. But it's an illustration of that Reagan was trying actually to reach out far more than we thought he was at the time. And he was also capable of self-deprecation. Again, this is something we don't see today at all. But Reagan understood that's very important for presidents to do, so he did things like this. So basically making fun of himself, which can be endearing, and he understood that. President Bush, he comes in after Reagan. He doesn't really understand public relations very well. I remember interviewing him the week after he took office, and he said, "I'll never be the communicator that Ronald Reagan was. I'm not very good on television." And he said, "I've been 6'3" ever since I was 18 years old, and people think I'm a little guy," he said. It was very interesting. He thought he was diminished by imagery, photography, and television. And so this is him and Barbara on the South Lawn. This is the most famous picture probably of Bush at Kennebunkport, not too far from where we are, at his summer home. What he did is his photographer, David Valdez, this was taken when he was vice president, but it reflects what he did as president too. One of the news magazines was doing a pictorial on Bush on vacation. The Bushes decided they didn't want an outside photographer to be there at the estate, so they allowed his photographer to be there, and the magazine went along with it. So David Valdez talks to Barbara Bush, and she says, well, I'll tell you what, I'm not going to tell you what we do. Why don't you show up at 6 o'clock tomorrow morning, and you'll see what happens. He shows up. He's asked to come to their bedroom. The doors fly open, and all the grandchildren come running in. That's what this is a picture of. Doro, their daughter, the grandchildren, they jump into bed with them. But you can see it's very insightful if you look at it. Barbara is a lot more camera savvy than President Bush. Bush, look at him, he's all disheveled, he didn't brush his hair. And this is a constant problem he had with his photographers. They say, well, we're going to take your picture. Why don't you at least comb your hair a little bit? But he said, no, it's not me. So he resisted the stagecraft, but this was the essence of Bush, which he allowed to be shown. Now, of course, he loses the election in 1992 to Bill Clinton. He does understand celebrity, and this is him on election night. He allowed some private things to be shown that other presidents did not allow. This is him telling George Stephanopoulos, now a TV anchor, who's then the communications director, you get back out there and you tell those reporters in that briefing room that I don't like the stories they're writing about me. So George says, well, I don't think I should do that. I mean, I think they know you don't like it. But it reflected Clinton's flash and fade temper, which he did have. And he didn't mind this being shown. And so you got the private side of Clinton that I think people came to realize was part of his presidency, but he understood this was part of the storyteller's function. You have the whole, we're now on the anniversary of that whole Monica Lewinsky issue where he was impeached. This is an interesting moment because when this story was breaking, and I was covering this at the time at the White House, all the photographers were looking for pictures of Bill with Monica, and nobody could find one. So Dirk Halstead, a photographer for Time magazine, said, they saw her picture, but no pictures of her with him, with President Clinton. He said, I know I've seen them together. So he hires a researcher, and they go through thousands and thousands of pictures, and they find the picture of Monica and Bill. Turned out she had been almost stalking him, showing up at events, at rope lines, wearing a beret to capture his attention. So they used this on the cover. So it was diligence and perseverance that enabled them to get to this picture. And she definitely got his attention, as we know now. And so that was really a squandered year. And that year you could not help but see the distress that Clinton was under in the public photography. So that was all part of the visual record at the time. This is the most famous picture of George W. Bush. This is the famous 9/11, 3 days after the attacks on the New York World Trade Towers. He's at Ground Zero. I happened to be at this event too. I was just at the base of this burned out fire truck that he stood on. He starts to talk to the crowd, and the first responders shout, "We can't hear you." So he pulls one of the first responders up from the crowd. That's the fellow here who's a volunteer, a retired guy who's helping. He gets a bullhorn and he says, I can hear you, and the people who knocked these buildings down will hear from all of us very soon. It's exactly what the country wanted to hear, and it was captured in this photograph of the moment. All of us who were there knew this would be the photograph of that time, and it really was. So Bush did understand the importance of the moment and the importance of image, at least in this case. So that's another important part of the photography. Now we get to President Obama. I show you this just to show how much the technology has changed. Remember that picture of Polk? Now look what's happening. People, it's the democratization of photography. People are taking pictures with their cameras, their mobile phone cameras. This happens all the time with presidents. It really took off with President Obama. He had more pictures taken of him than any president in history. He was probably more photographed than any human being in the history of the planet. It used to be that, remember I said Lincoln had 70 pictures taken of himself during his presidency. That's a little more than 4 years. How many pictures do you think Obama had taken of himself during 8 years? 4 million pictures. Now, you can go through the archives and look through them. As I say, there are pictures. But his photographer now, Pete Souza, is back using digital photography in ways that had not been used before. So he's using Facebook, and he's using Flickr and Tumblr and the White House website to send the pictures directly to the country as his own pipeline of public relations reflecting Obama. The famous picture of him in the Situation Room when he orders the raid on bin Laden. You can see him sitting there. Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State, has a fan to her mouth. Something is going on here. This is the actual raid. They let Pete Souza come in, a very highly sensitive secret moment. This showed how Obama understands the importance of the visual moment. He has a wonderful understanding of the private side of the president. This is what I was getting at before. Do you ever see this kind of thing with President Trump? No. You never see this kind of thing. This is President Obama and Michelle are, after a formal event, he's lent her his tuxedo jacket. They're in a freight elevator. Lots of presidents travel in freight elevators because they're more secure, so it's very unglamorous. But look at the Secret Service guys and the staff. They don't know where to look. They're afraid they may look at some intimate moment here, and so they're looking at their notes, the floor, the wall, off into the distance. But the president's always complaining about lack of privacy. You can see what they have, what they're talking about here. He loved to have pictures taken with kids, not just his own, but other kids. This is a Halloween picture of a kid coming to the White House as a Spiderman, and President Obama pretends to be caught in the web of Spider-Boy. This is the kind of picture that, again, Pete Souza put out, very endearing kind of picture. This is probably my favorite picture of Obama. An African-American staff member is leaving the White House. He brings his family in to say goodbye to President Obama. His younger son looks at President Obama, obviously an African-American family, and says, "Your hair looks just like mine. I wonder if it feels like mine." So President Obama says, "Why don't you see for yourself?" So he bends down. The little boy touches the top of his head, and President Obama says, "What do you think?" And the little boy says, "Yeah, feels just like mine." So it's the role model idea, and it's that larger story. Obama was very serious about being a role model, and I think this illustrates that, but there's many cases of this. Now we're with President Trump. President Trump, this is the image he wants to convey. I remember when I started giving talks about President Trump, and I would show pictures of him, people would say to me, "Why are you always showing pictures of him mad or scowling?" Well, this is the image he wants to convey. This is what he wants to show the country. The larger-than-life, angry disruptor. And he's still doing this. This is, again, the classic picture at the top of the stairs at Air Force One. But look at the look on his face. You know, he's very unhappy about something. Again, he's at an event. Remember that Nixon picture? There he is, the firm, strong president. He's in charge. This is another theme you see with President Trump. But you don't see those private moments with him. Now, he has a photographer named Sheila Craighead who worked for Laura Bush, knows her way around the White House, but either he's not letting her take the private pictures or they're not there. That's another possibility. Or they're not releasing them. But this is the kind of thing he likes. A moment he had his grandchildren walking across the South Lawn. He does have a good relationship with his grandkids. There's something there, but he just doesn't, I don't think he trusts the photographers enough to let this be shown. This is the first picture that was released of him, his official portrait. And in this picture, this is the classic scowling, so something's bothering President Trump. This picture was distributed all around the country, and it was all in all the offices. Then somebody at the White House figured, well, there's another side to President Trump. So they came up with this. And it's much, you know, it's like night and day, isn't it? And now this is the picture that's of him all over the country. So something has changed here, but really not enough. You're really not getting another side to President Trump. And that's, I think, part of the problem he has. He just is not showing that outreach or that other personal side that people want in their president. And I don't see that changing anytime soon. Just real quick, just show you some of the photographers. This is Cecil Stoughton. This is the guy, these are the staff photographers. This was Kennedy's guy, Yuichi Okamoto. I show you this because you can actually see him here with Lyndon Johnson, not what's behind the camera, David Kennedy and Ford. This is the photographers in later years. Eric Cantor, Bush the son's photographer, Bob McNeely, Clinton's, Dave Valdez, Bush the father's, and David Kennerly today. And this is Pete Souza, who's the photographer for Reagan, and this is Sheila he's photographer for Reagan and Obama. Sheila Craighead, the current photographer. We'll wind up with the news photographers just to get an idea how difficult it is for them. They're in a scrum. They get nothing special. They're just all get 30 seconds and then they have to leave. So there's really not a lot they can do now to get good pictures of President Trump because they're sort of stuck in this mass of photographic humanity, and so you don't get a lot of special photographs. So with that, we'll have to take some questions. Thank you.
So we have time for a few questions for sure. Make sure when you say your questions, we say where you're from and who you are and say it loudly so that we all can hear you up here.
I'm Katie. I'm a former U.S. Coast Guard photojournalist, and I was back in the days of speed graphic when you took one shot and you had to take the whole darn film holder out, turn it over, pull the slide out, and do it again.
That's right.
So this technology of digital.
That's right. That's right. Well, photographers here will be very sympathetic to this. It's so different now. Like, was that the speed graphic you were talking about?
Yeah, 4x5.
Remember those big cameras with the big flash bulb, and you take the pictures, and it took forever to get, compared to today, to get another frame in there. Like you say, you have to take the whole contraption apart, really, to put the other frame in, and so you didn't get a lot of spontaneous pictures, and as you know. So the technology has advanced so much, it's just unbelievable. And Trump is not using it, but Obama did. So, yeah.
My name is Gabriella DeConti. I'm a government major from Massachusetts. I had a question about, you kind of touched on Pete Souza using different social media accounts to post photos, especially the ones that he took during his time with President Obama. And a lot of times he uses them in a way to reflect what's going on today in Trump's presidency.
Yes.
Especially, with Trump trying to overturn a lot of what Obama himself did in office. So I was wondering, is that to you something, I don't see it as being a very typical thing for White House photographers to do. Do you think that this is a new kind of norm, or just the Trump presidency being the atypical?
Well, it's really both. I think you heard the question, but basically what's happening is that since Pete Souza left and President Obama left office, Pete Souza, it's not that he has access to special pictures. He just knows the best pictures that were taken. We can all get the same pictures he's using, but he knows where they are. He doesn't have to look through 4 million pictures. He can pretty much pinpoint them. So what he's doing is when President Trump does something, he will contrast Trump's approach to Obama's approach to make Trump look bad and Obama to look good. Like when there was a case where President Trump was insulting the leaders of New Zealand and other countries, Souza would put out pictures of him in very companionable, relations with these people to show he handled things differently. By the way, yesterday President Trump met with some of the families of people who were killed in the Florida massacre. You didn't get a lot of empathy there. I would guess that in the next few days, Souza is going to release pictures of President Obama at those kind of events. A much different approach. He's crying sometimes. President Bush, the son, did the same thing after 9/11. There was the personal side of it, which you don't get with President Trump. But so what Souza is doing is he's using the post-presidency of President Obama to criticize President Trump, and that's happening a lot. And that is a new thing, but I think it is going to continue, and it may continue whoever succeeds Trump. But certainly Souza is going to continue to do that now. Yes?
My name is Jesse. I'm a government major from New Hampshire. So I noticed that Melania is the only first lady that didn't show up in this slideshow. I was just wondering if you could talk about how she's kind of challenging the norms of what it means to be a first lady.
Yeah. Well, she is. I mean, that's a whole other lecture. where do you start? You know, she is not with her husband sometimes, where other first ladies would be there for sure. What's happened in the last few weeks is that she hasn't accompanied him to Mar-a-Lago. She didn't accompany him to the State of the Union. She took a separate car, which is unheard of. The White House had an explanation. She just wanted to be closer to her guests. Okay, whatever. But it also paralleled the disclosure, the accusation that he had an affair with this porn actress a few months after their son was born, Barron was born. So the speculation is maybe she's mad at him. Well, maybe, you know, that could well be. And then there's another accusation that he had an affair with a playmate. So there's things going on that you can explain the distance that may be there between the two of them. We don't know. They don't want to talk about it, and they won't answer the questions. So, but there is definitely a distance. Now, so part of the reason I didn't show you a lot of pictures of Melania is that there are not a lot of pictures of them together in anything but the most formal settings. So it's really not interesting. And I think Melania wants it that way for whatever reason. And I don't want to jump the gun, but something's going on there that we have, and we'll have to speculate for now. So, is there anyone else? Yes.
Hi, my name is Rachel. I'm from Woodstock, New York. Do you think that the democratization of technology inhibits or rather gives greater importance to the value of White House photography? Yeah. And how does this generational shift affect that role?
Yeah, I think that the democratization of photography, how that affects what, the White House staff photographers or just photographers in general, or the presidency. I think you probably want to get into all that. But basically, I think it's good that people can get their own pictures of the presidents. I mean, you get pictures now with these cell phones that are better in quality than the pictures that the White House staffers would get, 50 years ago. You can certainly get more spontaneous images than they used to get, and certainly before that too. I think the problem is access, and Trump has shut down the access, but so did Obama, and people don't tend to realize that. What Pete Souza did with President Obama is he excluded a lot of these news photographers from the best pictures because he wanted to get them himself and distribute them himself. Pete doesn't like to talk about that, but that's what he did. And a lot of these news photographers were very upset with him about this and still are. And some of them say that they get better access to President Trump, even though it's formal settings and not the private stuff, than they did with Obama because Souza was excluding them from a lot of pictures. So there's a lot of hard feelings there. But I think that with the, as I say, the democratization of photography, I think by and large it's a good thing, and I'm glad it's happening. And then there's always technology being developed and always technology improving. And we were just talking earlier about now the White House news photographers are saying they expect within a few years they all have completely silent cameras. So, you know those pictures of the president and you hear all the shutters going off, hundreds and hundreds of pictures being taken. You won't get that anymore. What that does is that gives them more of the opportunity to be unobtrusive. And that's what the photographers want. That's what the chief photographers want. They want the president to sort of forget that they're there so that they can get the more candid images. And sometimes some of them have succeeded in that and some of them haven't. The best White House photographers have been good photographers, but they also had the trust of the president, which is really vital. So the president will understand that they're taking pictures, but then will sort of forget about it and not always be posing and staging things. And that's what the photographers want. But I think the new technologies are going to enhance that. It's going to be easier to take these private pictures of the presidents because the presidents will not feel the photographer is sort of in the way of whatever else is going on. Anyone else? Okay. Okay, great.
Ken, thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.